The country was already in darkness, living under a grim industrial curfew known as the three-day week. But the political war that gripped Britain was about to become a war of flesh and blood. On a motorway outside Manchester, a silent, deadly enemy was waiting. This is the story of the 4 days that shattered Britain's peace, its government, and the lives of a single family. The date was the 4th of February, 1974. Just after 11 o'clock on a Sunday evening, a coach pulled onto the M62 motorway from Manchester. It was packed with the families of servicemen, young wives and children, returning to their barracks in Catterick and Darlington. They were riding the bus because the trains, crippled by a nationwide rail strike, were simply not running. The ordinary flow of life had stopped, leaving these families completely vulnerable. The driver, Roland Hanley, a director of the coach company, was having an excellent time. By midnight, most of the passengers were asleep as the coach cruised smoothly through the darkness toward Leeds. Then there was an almighty, heart-stopping bang. 25 pounds of high explosive, detonated by the Provisional Irish Republican Army, had gone off in a luggage locker. The rear of the vehicle was shredded, blackened wreckage torn apart by the force of the blast. Hanley, an Air Force veteran, somehow managed to steer the disintegrating coach to the side of the road, but nothing could have prepared him for the scene outside. He saw bodies strewn across the motorway, people staggering from the wreck covered in blood, and the metallic, bitter smell of cordite hanging heavy in the cold air. In all, 12 people were killed that night. Corporal Clifford Houghton, only 23 years old, died instantly, alongside his wife Linda, his 5-year-old daughter, and his 2-year-old son. A whole family wiped out in a single, indiscriminate act of terror. This was not an accident. It was the latest, and until then, most devastating attack in a campaign the Irish Republican Army had decided to bring directly to Britain. For years, the political conflict in Northern Ireland had raged, a terrible background noise that most people in England, Scotland, and Wales wished would simply go away. The violence was confusing, remote, and often ignored by the public. The IRA's new strategy was brutally simple: to terrorize Britain until its public opinion pressed the government to withdraw entirely. But this brutal tactic failed to solve Britain's crisis. Instead, it was simply the prelude to a much larger, more bewildering national war. The bombing was only one front in a war that was already tearing the country apart. This was a nation paralyzed, not by foreign invasion, but by internal strife, a kingdom fighting a civil war with itself. The main battle was political, economic, and industrial, and its general was a man who, by all accounts, should have been triumphant: Prime Minister Edward Heath. Heath had been in power for nearly 4 years. He was the embodiment of the competent, modernizing technocrat, a keen yachtsman who saw the nation as a ship to be steered. His ambition was to modernize Britain. Instead, he found himself bogged down in crises. Northern Ireland was a constant bleeding wound. Inflation was skyrocketing. A property and banking bubble he had stoked had burst. He was a yachtsman who knew how to sail, but his ship was about to be sunk by a force he never saw coming: a single enemy beneath the earth. The final fatal challenge came from the coal mines. For months, the National Union of Mine Workers had been demanding a massive pay increase. Heath's government, obsessed with controlling inflation, refused to concede. By the start of the year, the miners had escalated their action into a full-scale strike. The coal-fired power stations, the literal engine of the British economy, began to fail. In response, Heath had imposed the 3-day working week, forcing factories, offices, and homes to restrict electricity use. The resulting atmosphere was unlike any election in memory. As historian Dominic Sandbrook wrote, "Nobody could remember an election in grimmer circumstances. It was a world of cold homes, rationed light, and fear. The political mood was not one of hope, but one of exhaustion and resentment. Most people had already tuned out, sick of the relentless strikes and the endless bad news. With the country at a breaking point, the only move left was an act of political desperation, a final, catastrophic roll of the dice. This was the context in which Heath made the decision of his political lifetime. 3 days after the M62 bombing, Heath called a general election. He did so not in a bid for unity, but in a final, desperate declaration of war against the industrial forces he believed were destroying the country. His campaign message was simple, stark, and polarizing, echoing a constitutional crisis. Who governs Britain? His young, hardline advisors, including future conservative titans like Nigel Lawson and Douglas Hurd, crafted a campaign that painted the Union leaders as Union barons, overmighty subjects who dared to hold the nation to ransom. The rhetoric was combative, designed to draw a clear line in the sand between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. Yet, Heath himself was profoundly uncomfortable with this aggressive tactic. He was, by instinct, a corporatist, a paternalist who believed in finding a moderate solution. His own speeches would often revert to talk of consensus and compromise. He wanted to crush the Union power, but he lacked the ruthless passion to sell that fight to the nation. He believed the public would recognize the existential threat posed by the strikes and rally behind the government. It was a clean, binary question, he thought, easily resolved by the ballot box. If you find stories of unlikely heroes and pivotal historical upsets compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every new subscriber helps us bring more of these dramatic, world-shaping moments to life. But the British public rarely responds to clean, binary choices. Heath had misjudged the mood entirely. His election call was not seen as a plea for a mandate, but as an act of political desperation, turning the crisis into a fateful wager that the weary public might punish him for even asking. The stage was set for a dramatic defeat that neither the government nor its rivals saw coming. This desperate gamble, made in the dark days of February, would soon be compounded by forces even Heath could not control, forces rising from within the opposition and from within his own party. The choice was not between order and chaos, but between a defeated general and a rival who, though utterly exhausted, had begun preparing a campaign not for victory, but for retreat. To understand how Heath sealed his own fate, we must first meet the man who was both his greatest rival and his political opposite, the cunning, battle-weary puppet master, Harold Wilson. In the midst of the chaos, only one man believed a choice could still be made. Edward Heath, the technocrat yachtsman, saw the nation as a ship requiring a steady hand. But his call to the polls was not a plea for unity. It was a declaration of war against the powerful, overmighty subjects who dared challenge him. Edward Heath's strategy? The who governs Britain? The question was meant to be his cannonade, a crushing blow to the unions. But the moment he fired, the narrative scattered. The public was tired of being commanded, tired of confrontation, and tired of the very man asking the question. This was the fundamental flaw of the technocrat. He understood systems, but not the volatile, emotional landscape of the common voter. He stood rigid, a man of profound integrity, yet utterly devoid of the political flexibility required to survive this crisis. His opponent, however, was a creature of pure political instinct. If Heath was the upright, unwavering general, Harold Wilson was the cunning, battle-scarred rival, the puppet master waiting in the wings. Wilson was a genius, reportedly achieving the highest marks ever recorded in his Oxford economics papers. He had risen to become Prime Minister in the 1960s, promising to modernize Britain with the white heat of technology. By 1974, however, that technological sheen had faded. Wilson looked and was bruised and exhausted. Yet he possessed an animal cunning that Heath entirely lacked. He was the man you wanted as your neighbor, kind-hearted, suburban, happy to lend you his lawnmower. He smoked a pipe, preferred tinned salmon, read Agatha Christie, and holidayed on the Scilly Isles, often photographed in unflatteringly tight shorts. His greatest political inspiration came not from socialism, but from the simple precepts of the Boy Scouts. This made him immensely relatable, but this genial facade concealed a ruthless political survivor. Wilson had won 4 out of the 5 elections he had fought. While the establishment might have despised his suburban air, the ordinary people saw him and thought, "Good old Harold, he's like me." The crisis, however, threatened to overwhelm even his cunning. Wilson was leading a Labour Party that had swung violently to the left. The direction of the party was no longer controlled by the leader, but by its internal structure. This meant the political agenda was increasingly set by zealots and idealists, not pragmatists. Labour was becoming a house divided, split between its high-minded, middle-class parliamentary representatives and the union bosses and activists. This was the classic division between the prune juice-drinking sandal-wearers and the horny-handed sons of toil. The resulting manifesto was no moderate policy platform. It was a radical document demanding nothing less than a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth. The tribune for this terrifying new agenda was Tony Benn. Benn, a former Viscount who had renounced his title, had reinvented himself as the voice of the common man. He walked picket lines and wore a parka. He promised to nationalize everything and restructure industry from the ground up. Benn's plans were staggering. The creation of a national enterprise board that would force all industry into 5-year planning agreements, backed by emergency acts allowing the state to take over the top 25 companies in Britain. To moderate Labour colleagues, this was sheer madness. Shadow Chancellor Denis Healey, a highly cerebral man, joked, "What a brilliant idea. Why don't we nationalise Marks and Spencer to make it as good as the Co-op?" Benn was not amused, convinced this exposed Healey as a capitalist running dog. But the Labour manifesto did not stop at nationalisation. Despite Britain having only been a member of the European Common Market for a year, the manifesto promised a referendum on leaving. For pro-Europeans, this was a second, terrifying, existential threat. To the press and the financial markets, Benn was a Bolshevik, threatening to turn Britain into a Warsaw Pact country. If you have a pivotal battle or forgotten crisis you think deserves this cinematic treatment, let us know in the comments below. Your input helps us decide what piece of history to tell next. The sheer scale of this radical agenda made the election an unpopularity contest between 2 groups widely perceived as incompetent. Heath was disliked for his failure to solve the industrial crisis. Wilson was feared because of the socialist army that stood behind him. In the city, fear had turned into hysteria. Taxes were already sky high, with the top rate of income tax at 83%. Now, with inflation through the roof, a burst property bubble, and secondary banks collapsing, the prospect of Tony Benn taking over the top 25 companies was truly terrifying. The papers were feeding the frenzy. They ran hysterical editorials and cartoons, dragging British industry by her hair. the establishment was convinced that Labour would bring total meltdown. But even within the Labour Party, confidence was shattered. Key figures like Roy Jenkins privately believed they deserved to lose. The party was fractured, a small group of energized idealists on the left versus a large, depressed, and hangdog middle ground led by Wilson. Wilson, tired and bruised, did his tours of working men's clubs, performing like an old music hall comedian doing his last routines. He was going through the motions of the campaign, while the man across the aisle, Edward Heath, was clinging to the belief that the logic of his question would prevail. But political logic rarely survives contact with the people, and the final fatal blow was about to come not from an angry union, but from an act of philosophical betrayal. The two main forces were set for collision, but the hidden power in this story was rising from the periphery, ready to shatter the entire framework of the election. While Heath battled the enemy, he could see the striking miners, his rival, Harold Wilson, wrestled with an enemy within, a Labour Party radicalized by zealots. They promised not mere change, but a fundamental and irreversible shift that sent a shock-wave of terror through the city, threatening to tear down the pillars of the British state. The atmosphere was thick with dread. The political elite had two choices, neither of them palatable. On one side, a rigid man asking the country to escalate a class war. On the other hand, a cunning survivor backed by a socialist agenda so radical it threatened to reshape the entire economy of the United Kingdom. Yet, there were chinks of light for Harold Wilson, and corresponding cracks appearing in Heath's supposedly solid mandate. Firstly, the dreaded three-day week was proving less disastrous than first feared. Many firms were simply adapting, using candles and ingenuity, proving the nation could cope with, or simply ignore, the government's dramatic intervention. The weather had been milder, and many felt the entire election call had been unnecessary, a political tantrum by an inflexible leader. Secondly, a third force was rapidly gaining ground, the Liberal Party, led by the flamboyant, droll, and eccentric Jeremy Thorpe. The Liberals stood for proportional representation, pro-Europeanism, and being generally agreeable. But in a choice between two widely disliked figures, the Liberals became the perfect protest vote. Day after day, their poll ratings climbed, suggesting a massive, silent desertion from the major parties. But the real, devastating bombshell came late in the campaign. On the 21st of February, the Pay Board, a Heath-like corporatist body, reported its findings. The miners were, in fact, underpaid. The body, established to provide objective support for Heath's stance, had instead utterly undermined his central argument. His reason for calling the election was instantly delegitimized. Heath, despite the catastrophic news, remained stubbornly optimistic. His strategists believed the polls, which still put the Conservatives 5 to 10 percentage points ahead, would hold. They were convinced the public would reward the government. Then, with only 4 days left before the vote, the biggest intervention of all occurred, an act of philosophical betrayal that shattered the Conservative campaign completely. This was the intervention of Enoch Powell. Powell, the Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton South West, was perhaps the most contradictory figure in British politics. He was a great scholar of Herodotus, yet he was best known for his incendiary Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. Kicked out of the Tory party by Heath for that speech, Powell became his implacable, brilliant opponent. Powell was not just a nationalist, he was a fierce free marketeer. He hated Heath's corporatism and his compulsory control of wages and prices, railing against it with withering pronouncements. Powell held immense populist appeal. On Sunday, the 23rd of February, in the Mecca Dance Hall in Birmingham, Powell delivered his final, explosive sermon. He declared that the election was a sham. The real question, he argued, was whether Britain would remain a democratic nation or become a mere province in a European superstate. He accused Heath of betraying British rights and freedoms to Europe. He announced that he would not stand for re-election. And then came the betrayal. He urged his followers not to vote Conservative, but to vote for the only party offering a referendum on Europe, the Labour Party. The headlines were immediately consumed by this act of political treason. In an extraordinary scene, when Powell appeared in Shipley, a furious supporter shouted, "Judas!" Powell, ever the classicist, roared back, "Judas was paid. I am making a sacrifice." The impact was devastating. The intervention threw a massive gift to Wilson and ensured that the working-class Tory vote in the West Midlands would splinter. Wilson, meanwhile, remained utterly despondent. Despite the pay board report and the Powell gift, terrible new trade figures had been announced. Wilson's chief policy advisor, Bernard Donahue, described the leader in his diary: slumped, tired, sour, scowling, his eyes dead as a fish. Both Heath and Wilson were exhausted. Wilson made a final broadcast that was purely anodyne. Then came Heath's final broadcast on Tuesday, a piece of political theatre. It featured footage of Heath on his boat, with the narrator declaring him an extraordinary man, a private man, a solitary man perhaps. Single-minded sums it up. This is a man the world respects, a man who has done so much, and yet a man who has so much left to do. And if you know someone who needs to hear the true story of Britain's worst political year, please share this video with them. Word of mouth helps us tell more of these untold stories. The contrast was complete. The crumbling party machine, led by a man on his yacht, facing a cynical rival who was so confident of losing that he was plotting his own escape. Wilson, terrified that a loss would end his political career, set up a bizarre, theatrical getaway plan. He planned to smuggle himself out the back door of his hotel, take a car to a different hotel, fly secretly to London, and land in Bedfordshire before driving home. It was a paranoid, convoluted plan that perfectly summed up the desperate chaos of his campaign. Election day arrived, foggy, miserable, and raining. The tension mounted all day. That evening, Wilson did a final tour of his constituency, described by Donahue as walking in the rain as the two of us, Harold Wilson and myself, lonely figures, lost in anonymous, wet streets. Everybody, I sensed, everybody saw him as a loser, finished, who would soon just be an old backbench MP. Wilson poured himself a stiff drink and sat down to watch the results. At midnight, the results began to flood in, and it became immediately clear. The entire election had been a catastrophic miscalculation. It was going to be excruciatingly close. By dawn the next morning, Friday, the result was confirmed. Heath's mandate had shattered. The Tories had won more votes, 37.9%, but Labour had won more seats, 301 to the Conservatives, 297. The Liberals, led by Thorpe, had won a staggering 19.3% of the vote, yet only 14 seats. The rest went to the nationalist parties. The dual-party system of British politics was broken. The outcome was a hung parliament, a political vacuum. Heath was still Prime Minister, and he desperately clung to power. His justification was Europe. The logic was clear. If the pro-European Conservatives and Liberals joined forces, they could govern. So began 4 days of intense, chaotic negotiations. Thorpe, despite personally liking the idea of being Home Secretary, faced massive internal resistance. His party members hated Heath and demanded one price for the coalition: a reform of the voting system. The Conservatives, exhausted and resistant, refused to give in to electoral reform. On Monday, Thorpe rang Heath and gave him the news. The deal was off. A miserable, utterly shell-shocked Edward Heath drove to Buckingham Palace to resign. He had been unlucky, but he had also played his hand with extraordinary political ineptitude. Meanwhile, a triumphant, though still shabby and crumpled, Harold Wilson was waiting at his house. His aides, tired and fractious, were bickering furiously. At 7 o'clock that Monday, the call came from the palace. Wilson and his wife Mary rode to the palace in a rented Daimler. The exhausted aides, stuffed in the back, sat downstairs and in the palace, while Wilson met the Queen, miserable because the palace heating, due to the 3-day week, had been turned off. He emerged, the victorious leader, yet looking every bit the weary figure who had prepared for defeat. He stepped out of the car at Downing Street and declared, "We've got a job to do. We can only do that job as one person, and I'm going right in to start that job now." But the victory was a lie. He had won power, but he had no mandate, and he was surrounded by a team that was already tearing itself apart. The choice was not between order and chaos, but between a defeated general and a rival who, though utterly exhausted, had begun preparing a campaign not for victory, but for retreat. To understand how Heath sealed his own fate, we must first meet the man who was both his greatest rival and his political opposite, the cunning, battle-weary puppet master, Harold Wilson. For more deep dives into the incredible battles that shaped our world and beyond, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.